Hi, this is Anthony. Welcome back to another one of my DB Cooper questions, answers, and comments videos where I answer readers' questions or their comments and make my own comments on recent activities in the Cooper sphere. Of course, as I begin, please do hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and hopefully you'll hit the like button. And at the end, please leave a comment. I really do appreciate your comments, even if you disagree with me. And as you can see, I have less than 200 subscribers to go before I can get monetized. I'd really like to do that before the end of the year. By the way, I'm not doing this channel in the hopes of getting rich. As you can see, at this point, my estimated earnings would be quite low on an annual basis, but being monetized helps the YouTube algorithm push my content to more people. Anyway, launching right in, I wanted to do a couple shout outs. In my fairly short episode on a piece of evidence in the Zodiac murders from the late 1960s. Be sure to check out that episode. It's episode 314. I had encouraged my viewers to check out Drew Beeson's channel, as well as the YouTube channel called Black Box Online Radio. Both these channels cover the Zodiac case on a regular basis, and one or the other looks at Jack the Ripper or the DB Cooper or other unsolved mysteries like that. I don't personally know either of those creators, but they seem like great guys, and after my episode looking at the unusual symbol connected with the Zodiac case, Drew Beeson discussed my thoughts from that video at length, and I do appreciate that. I'm always flattered when experts in the field reference me. That same week, DeHan of Black Box Online Radio discussed at length a response to an answer that I left on one of his videos where he had a challenge question concerning whether the Zodiac killer was a terrorist. And again, I do appreciate his reference to me, and if you're interested in my answer to that, be sure to check out his episode where he discusses my answer. So of course, hopefully you watch this entire video to the end and check out my other videos, but be sure to check out those other two gentlemen's channels and subscribe to them. You'll find them very informative. Let's launch right into some questions and comments from my viewers. Here's a comment from They Can't All Be Zodiac. They say, it's a cattle branding symbol. And of course the symbol in question is the one circled here, and it looks like two mountains and a valley with four dots or something along those lines. Now, I have no definite answer to what it is. I propose that one thing to look at, not a solution, but something to look at, would be weather symbols, because on weather maps, wind is shown with these symbols aimed at the particular direction that the wind is going, and also for each 5 and 10 knots per hour that the wind is blowing is shown with similar hatch marks. That's what I discussed in my video. I'm not saying that that's what the answer is. I'm saying that it might be something to look at. I also point out that some people believe that it looks like a cattle brand, and I think it could possibly be one. I mentioned in my previous video that I spent quite a bit of time online looking through many different resources that have cattle brands. There are none that are comprehensive, but at this point, while some people have found similar brands, I don't see anybody who has found a cattle brand that I believe is similar enough where people would say, yes, that's definitely it. Certainly, the opportunity is there for people to continue looking, and maybe somebody will find one. Also, as a former Boy Scout in the past, Boy Scouts have supposedly sometimes used symbols to mark trails or maps or things like that. 30 years ago when I was a Boy Scout, nobody knew anything about that and nobody used them. But it could be that in the 1930s and 40s they did use symbols on a regular basis when they were out camping. I looked through some online sources and couldn't find anything at all remotely close between symbols that the Boy Scouts used, supposedly, and the particular symbol used on this card attributed to the Zodiac. And also, probably starting around the 1930s when the Great Depression hit and there were a lot of hobos riding trains around the country, supposedly they would leave symbols around letting people know where you could find food, where you could find shelter, where you could find friendly people that might help you out, as well as people to avoid. Looking through some online examples of these so-called hobo symbols, I couldn't find anything that they used that was close to the symbol on the Zodiac card. So I think that it does look like a cattle brand, but the jury is still out, as no exact cattle brand has been found that looks just like this one. And again, one must remember that even if this is a legitimate Zodiac Halloween card, that the symbol provided there may be completely made up just to throw people off on a wild goose chase. Again, I argue that serial killers such as the Zodiac, when they provide written communication to the media or authorities, they usually salt it with some accurate information to prove that it really is from the perpetrator, but often they then throw in other stuff that is misleading and doesn't really identify them. This could be an example of that. Okay, moving on to the next set of comments. They are in response to a recent post where I read a lengthy document that Robert Rackstraw submitted to a court concerning what he thought was harassment from Thomas J. Colbert, who is a reporter who did a documentary as well as a book claiming that Rackstraw was D.B. Cooper. Now, Rackstraw, who's now deceased, was a sketchy scoundrel who tried to fake his own death, who perhaps was connected to the death of his stepfather, who is evidently illegally providing technical assistance to Iran, for which he was arrested by the United States government. He did have a military background, but he also claimed ranks and medals for which he was not entitled to, which there's documentary evidence as far as that. So, was Rackstraw Cooper? I don't think so, and most researchers do not think so. Again, we've found somebody who has a background that we think Cooper may have had. He does seem to be the type of person who might do the skyjacking crime that Cooper did. But unfortunately for researchers, there are a number of seemingly credible candidates who have similar backgrounds, who were somewhere in the area potentially during the crime, or at least they cannot be excluded from being in the Pacific Northwest at the time of the skyjacking. In the early 1970s, there were many men in the United States who had some type of parachute training from World War II or Korea or Vietnam or just recreationally. So researchers find themselves with many candidates, and Rackstraw is one. But again, I and many others doubt that he did it. And by the way, if after looking at the evidence for and against other people you think that Rackstraw is the best candidate, please let me know. As far as comments and questions, here's one from Bud Green Jeans, who periodically writes comments. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that comment. It's very kind of you. And an actual question in response to the video that I made from Steve. He writes, was Colbert a grifter and just delusional? Here I think there is a little confusion. Thomas J. Colbert was the reporter who has identified Rackstraw as Cooper. And by the way, Colbert also does research on the Zodiac case. And personally, I have nothing against Colbert. I tend to disagree with him on his conclusions on these two cases, but as far as I'm aware, he's a sincere and honest journalist who is trying to find the solution to these mysteries. So, I think that what Steve meant was to say, was Rackstraw a grifter and delusional? Certainly, delusional might be something that you could come away with from the legal document, which I read most of. In reading it took up probably close to 45 minutes of the 50 minutes of the video. It's interesting sometimes when you read people's manifestos or legal briefs, when they're not a lawyer, they may come off as delusional, and I have no background in psychology, so I'm not going to attempt to guess at a clinical definition of delusional, but I think that on a general level, we kind of have a gut level feeling of what delusional means. But even if somebody is to a degree delusional, again in a non-clinical sense, it doesn't mean that they can't get through life fairly normally. And normally is kind of a loaded word there, or at least perhaps ironic. After all, did Rackstraw leave a normal life? He did seem to be a decorated soldier, even if some of his decorations were not actually issued to him. He does seem to have earned some of his medals legitimately. Potentially being connected to a murder is not necessarily normal. Being an advisor or trainer to the Iranian government on helicopters is not necessarily normal. Trying to fake your own death in an airplane crash is not necessarily normal. In a way, he kind of sounds like a lovable rogue, but he does seem to be, in some sense, a grifter. So, I agree there. As far as delusional, it's hard to tell. I think what he wrote in his legal document was sincere, but it comes off in an overly legalistic fashion, where, as I point out, many of the terms that he uses are incorrect, and in some cases seems to be terms only used in real estate law when he's discussing libel, slander, and attempted murder. But he points out that he's not a lawyer and begs the court's forgiveness if he makes errors in it, and I think we can understand that. However, what I point out is his type of thinking and writing is reminiscent of what we see with the sovereign citizens movement today. Trying to use legal terms, and especially an overabundance of legal terms, or other words, to try to push through concepts that they sincerely believe in, but for which there is little actual basis in reality behind. But I think that if they keep on, they think that if they keep on saying these things over and over again quickly, that it will overwhelm the reader or the listener into starting to believe what the person is saying. And the same is true when people are using a lot of jargon, especially legal jargon, either in English or Latin. If a person is using what sounds like sophisticated legal language, then the listener or reader will assume that the person knows what they're talking about because they seem to be educated and knowledgeable, even if the words really are not used correctly, and really the whole concept is just a word salad, just designed to overwhelm the listener into giving up arguments and accepting as valid what the presenter is saying. And I've seen that in personal dealings that I've had with sovereign citizens, and I see that in what Rackstraw wrote in his legal document. Okay, moving on to the next comment. MRJ Productions writes, "Thanks for this video. I had no idea the Somerton case had been solved. I think you're right. D.B. Cooper, dressed up in a simple suit, was likely ex-military, a loner who knew he likely would not survive but tried anyway. I think he simply didn't survive the fall, and the money found in Tina Bar simply blew away from him while he fell from the plane. DNA seems likely to one day give us an answer. I think, as you do, it won't be someone we suspect. The legend, however, will likely exist for years to come." So, if anyone's unfamiliar with the Somerton Man case, this is one from Australia, where in the late 1940s the body of a man was found slumped against a seawall at a beach in Australia. No one came forward to identify the body. There was no ID on him. Later on, some things were found at a bus station that were connected to him, which provided some clues, but no definitive answers. Eventually, after re-examination of the clothing, a small scrap of paper was found in a pocket. It turns out that it had been torn from a book, and eventually the book was found that it had been torn out of a book that evidently had been discarded by tossing it into somebody's car through an open window. Some clues pointed towards a nurse who lived very close to where the body was found, like a few hundred yards from where the body was found. When interviewed by the police, she seemed to be very evasive, but claimed not to know anything about the body. Her daughter later stated that her mother knew Russian and was perhaps a Soviet spy. Undoubtedly, there was a lot of Soviet intelligence gathering in Australia at the time, in particular due to the atomic research and testing on the continent. In the book that was found, there was the impression of a string of letters, which was thought to have been a code. Oh, and the man was determined to have been the victim of digitalis poisoning. So that sounds like an interesting case. Somebody who may have been connected to a Soviet espionage ring, who later was liquidated, perhaps by the Soviets. And Australian authorities for 70 years are unable to definitively identify the person. But of course, unlike all of our other favorite unsolved cases, they had the body of the Somerton Man, which was buried at the time. And with DNA and online genealogy, it's becoming easier and easier to solve some of these cases when you have definitive DNA. And in fact, they didn't even need to dig up the body, because they realized that there were some hairs from the body that were embedded in a plaster cast of the face and upper torso that had been made prior to burial. And so, using DNA, they've been able to determine that the guy was likely just a lonely divorced man who may have been in the area trying to find his ex-wife. Possibly this mysterious nurse, who may or may not have known Russian, may have known the man's ex-wife, and that's why he might have been in the area, perhaps trying to contact her to find a lead on his ex-wife. And not having any children, and realizing that his life was going nowhere, and he couldn't locate his ex-wife, or she didn't want to have anything to do with him, he ended up taking his own life, smoking a cigarette and watching the waves of the ocean crash on the sand as he peacefully passed away. I think that this case is a good one for people to keep in mind when we look at D.B. Cooper or the Zodiac or Jack the Ripper. There are many, many suspects, and some of them seem to be excellent candidates because they tick off a lot of boxes for a profile that's been created. In the case of D.B. Cooper, he parachuted out of the back of a plane, so people argue that he had a lot of skydiving or parachuting experience because of that. Other people point out that because of the chutes that he selected, that he really didn't have much, if any, experience. People point out that some of the copycat skyjackers didn't have any parachuting experience and they generally survived. People assume that Cooper had a military background of some type, and of course, during much of the previous 25 or so years, there was conscription, so many American men had some type of military experience. So I think the whole point of this is we need to be careful when we're looking at what we think are clues, because for those things that are actual clues that we can agree upon, the experts don't always agree upon the interpretation of them. And often what we think are clues, especially in the Cooper case, don't always bear out as being actual pieces of evidence, but rather something which someone supposedly reported to someone else and then became canonized. And I agree with the commenter that I think likely whomever Cooper was, he probably ended up in the Columbia and drowned, and therefore is not any of the candidates which have been brought forward so far, because all of them survived past late 1971. Again, I think that that's the likelihood. That couldn't be proven in a court of law, but none of the suspects at this point could be proven in a court of law as being the perpetrator. And I think that there are some people who were not that bad at being suspects. Ted Braden, for one. These suspects had the background. They were in the area. They had the motive. One of them could have been Cooper. So I'm not closing my mind to being willing to accept that one of them could have been Cooper. But at this point, there's no gotcha evidence that I see that settles my mind on it. I think that there's a better chance that whoever Cooper was somebody that nobody has proposed at this point. So, if I'm right and Cooper did not survive, and even if he did, I think that there is a strong likelihood that Cooper was somebody that has never been on anyone's radar. Probably a single man, probably unemployed at the time, and so if he did end up in the Columbia or end up in a blackberry bush never to be found, he was somebody that no one reported as missing after Thanksgiving 1971. So, thank you very much for that comment. And I think I'll make this the last comment for this video. This one actually isn't about D.B. Cooper, but Jack the Ripper. It's in reference to the short video that I made about Charles Allen Lechmere. This is somebody that a Swedish researcher has identified as being Jack the Ripper. Now, all the evidence is circumstantial, but Lechmere happened to be the first one upon the scene of the first crime, and this comes from a newspaper account at the time, which then seems to have been completely forgotten until recently being rediscovered by researchers. Also, when you analyze where Lechmere lived and where he worked, I believe 3 of the crimes took place along one of the 2 routes that he would take and occurred at days and times when he would be walking to work. And then there were 2 crimes called the double murder that happened on a Sunday when he was off, and they took place near where his mother lived, which would be an area where he'd be familiar because he'd lived with her up to a certain point. I don't know if this case will definitively be solved ever. There doesn't seem to be any good DNA evidence left. There do seem to be some other candidates that are fairly good and may have been put into an insane asylum right after the last murder, which would indicate why the murder stopped. But just like in the Somerton Man case, we need to be careful with Jack the Ripper. People have come up with a profile of what we think Jack the Ripper was. And part of this profile stems from Victorian times and may be clouded with Victorian perceptions of the type of people that commit crimes, one which is no longer considered to be a standard profiling methodology. And I know nothing about profiling other than just watching TV shows, so take that with a grain of salt. But I think that for people who have at least casually looked at Jack the Ripper, this profile of a poor, woman-hating Jewish epileptic butcher may be extrapolating more than what should be. Yet I still see videos where people point out, oh, this candidate is Jewish and he was an epileptic. I know a couple epileptic people, and none of them are predisposed towards serial killing. And of course, at that time, and still continues to a degree, Jews were often seen as sinister perpetrators of crimes, when in fact I'm sure that if you look at actual statistics of criminals on a large scale, the Jews are probably underrepresented as perpetrators of violent crimes. And before I end, a couple other thoughts along these lines. Often in all of these serial killer cases, at least in the majority of them where the perpetrators are men, the unknown suspects are often described as misogynist or that they hated women. I'm not sure if this is a useful lens to analyze the situation, especially when trying to solve an unsolved case. I think that authors tried to make these individuals into monsters. I see this in Patricia Cornwell's books on Jack the Ripper, and most researchers think that she's simply completely wrong about who she's identified as Jack the Ripper, in particular because her suspect is believed to have been in France or Belgium at the time of one of the killings and therefore couldn't have committed it. But if an author, even if they have circumstantial evidence, perhaps even some direct evidence that would indicate a particular suspect, terming them a monster or a misogynist or a woman hater creates an atmosphere where the reader is going to start believing that the suspect is those things. But those are not clinical definitions of human characteristics. Those are emotional terms. And they may, in fact, be factually incorrect anyway. There is a wide variety of very bad people, mainly men, throughout history, but unfortunately a lot of them in the 20th century, that we might casually call monsters because they perpetrated great evil upon humanity. We can call Idi Amin a monster. We can call Hitler a monster. We can call Stalin a monster. What the Nazis did was evil. The Cultural Revolution in China could be termed evil. What Saddam Hussein did against the Kurds could be called evil. But these are not clinical terms used by psychologists or psychiatrists or sociologists. Crazy or evil or a monster are not scientific terms. And when you're trying to use logic and reason and science to come to a solution to a mystery, those terms and concepts get in the way. If you use malignant narcissist or other terms that narrowly define a person's behavior or personality, using standard scientifically accepted sociological phrases and definitions, that's one thing, but we need to be very careful in using general terms to whip up support for concluding somebody was a monster and therefore was Jack the Ripper. And when you look at other cases like Jeffrey Dahmer, who we all know was a homosexual, his victims were men. Does this mean that he didn't like men? From my understanding is he seemed to like having sex with men, and he also liked to kill them and sometimes eat them. I don't think that he killed the men because he didn't like men. He killed them because he had some compulsion to do so. A lot of serial killers are single, but some of them are married. If they didn't like women, why would they marry? And again, I'm not an expert at all in this, but we need to be careful in looking at somebody's marital status or gender preferences or other assumptions about them liking or disliking particular genders, or realizing that serial killers have a compulsion to kill. It's not necessarily because they're overly religious and they want to get rid of prostitutes because God tells them to, or because they had a bad relationship with their mother, or things like that. The world is full of people who hate other types of people, and they never commit crimes or never become serial killers. So when looking at these cases where there's no DNA and very little actual evidence left, and most of what we have is circumstantial and based on profiles, we need to be very careful in using those profiles when condemning potentially innocent people. And of course, any suspect in the Jack the Ripper case is long dead, but that doesn't stop people from today looking at current crimes and jumping to conclusions and passing quick judgment over somebody's guilt. Okay, I think that's all for today. I do appreciate you sticking with me till the end. I really do find these comments and questions from my viewers to be very interesting. And sometimes it takes me a while to get to responding to them, but I eventually always do either respond personally in a message or with a video like this one. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help me get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. And do check out Drew Beeson's and Black Box Online Radio's YouTube channels. And be sure to let those guys know you found them through me if that's the case. Thanks again and see you soon.